Karen's wedding was a glittering lie, and I was the fool who let her stage it on my land. By the time my cows stormed her perfect day, her 911 call was just the cherry on top of her betrayal. My name's Jack Harlan, and my ranch in Montana's Bitterroot Valley is my sanctuary. 3,000 acres of rolling hills, grazing cattle, and silence that soothes the soul. I've never been one for crowds, but when Karen, my old college friend, begged to use my land for her dream wedding, I caved. She was always a whirlwind, charming, pushy, and a little too good at getting her way. "Jack, it'll be small, just family," she swore, her voice dripping with sincerity. I should have known better. Karen's promises were as solid as a house of cards in a windstorm. The day before the wedding, I watched trucks roll in, unloading tables, tents, and enough flowers to choke a meadow. Her small gathering ballooned into a 200-person spectacle, complete with a string quartet and a champagne fountain. My ranch, my quiet haven, was transformed into a circus. I gritted my teeth, figuring I'd let it slide for one day. After all, Karen had helped me through some dark times in college, her optimism pulling me out of a spiral after my dad passed. I owed her this much. Or so I thought. By noon on the wedding day, the chaos was unbearable. Guests in tuxedos trampled my wildflower patches, and the caterers dumped trash in my creek. I tried talking to Karen, but she brushed me off, her veil fluttering as she snapped, "Jack, it's my day. Relax." Her groom, a slick city type named Brett, smirked and offered me a glass of champagne, like I was some hired help. My blood boiled, but I held my tongue. Then I saw it, Karen's crew had left my main gate open. My cattle, 150 head of Angus, were grazing dangerously close to the wedding setup. I warned her twice, politely, to secure the gate. She laughed it off, saying, "Cows won't ruin my vibe." That's when I snapped. If Karen wanted to treat my home like her personal playground, I'd give her a show. I didn't plan to ruin her wedding, not exactly. But I stopped my ranch hands from closing the gate. I radioed them, voice steady, "Let the herd move. Let's see how Karen's vibe holds up." Within minutes, the cattle wandered toward the music and lights, drawn by curiosity. What started as a slow trickle became a stampede. Hooves thundered, kicking up dust as my cows crashed through the reception, toppling tables and sending guests screaming. The string quartet fled, violins abandoned. Karen's pristine white dress was splattered with mud as she shrieked, "Jack, you monster." Brett was on his phone, dialing 911, yelling about vandalism and assault by livestock. I stood on the hill, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. It felt wrong, but it also felt right. The sheriff arrived an hour later, lights flashing. Karen, mascara streaking, pointed at me like I'd burned her house down. "He did this on purpose," she screamed. The sheriff, an old friend named Tom, raised an eyebrow at me. "Jack, you really let your cows loose on a wedding?" I shrugged. Gate was open. Cows move. Not my fault her small party turned my ranch into a zoo. Tom shook his head, half amused, but wrote me a warning for negligent property management. Karen wasn't satisfied, she wanted me arrested, sued, ruined. Brett, still clutching his phone, muttered about lawyers. I didn't care. They disrespected my land, my home, my trust. If a few cows ruined her bouquet toss, that was her problem. But the story doesn't end with cows and chaos. Karen's wedding was just the spark. What I didn't know then was how deep her betrayal ran. 2 days later, I found out she'd been leasing my land behind my back, selling event rights to other planners for months, pocketing thousands while promising me nothing but gratitude. My ranch, my legacy, was her side hustle. The wedding was just her latest scam, dressed up in lace and lies. I dug deeper, and the truth gutted me. Karen had been using our friendship, my grief over my dad, to manipulate me into opening my gates. She wasn't the friend I remembered, she was a hustler in a veil. I confronted her at her hotel before she left for her honeymoon. The lobby was quiet, her suitcases stacked by the door. "You used me," I said, voice low but shaking. "You turned my home into your ATM." Karen didn't flinch. Her eyes, cold as winter, met mine. "You're too sentimental, Jack. It's just business." That was the end of a friendship I'd once cherished. I walked away, vowing to protect my ranch from vultures like her, no matter the cost. The fallout was messy. Karen sued me for emotional distress and property damage, claiming my cows ruined her $50,000 wedding. I countersued, exposing her shady deals. The legal battle dragged on, draining my savings and my patience. My ranch hands, loyal as ever, stood by me, but the stress took its toll. I'd lie awake at night, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too reckless. Should I have just closed the gate? But then I'd remember her smirk, her lies, and the cows felt like justice. Months later, the case settled out of court. I didn't get much, just enough to cover legal fees, but Karen's reputation took a bigger hit. Word spread in our small town, and her event planning side gig dried up. Brett left her, citing irreconcilable differences, and probably her obsession with revenge. I'd won, sort of, but the victory was hollow. My ranch was quiet again, the wildflowers slowly regrowing, but the betrayal lingered like a bruise. I'd trusted Karen, let her into my world, and she turned it into a battlefield. As winter closed in, I stood by the creek where her caterers had dumped their trash. The water ran clear again, but the memory of that day didn't. I'd let my anger take the wheel, and maybe I'd gone too far. But my ranch was my father's legacy, my home. Karen had tried to take it, piece by piece, and I'd fought back the only way I knew how, with hooves and dust. The cows weren't just chaos, they were my line in the sand. The Montana winter crept in like a thief, stealing the warmth from the valley and leaving my ranch in a quiet, icy grip. I'd hoped the cold would numb the sting of Karen's betrayal, but it didn't. Every creak of the barn, every gust across the fields, reminded me of her voice, smooth as honey, sharp as a blade, calling my home, just business. I'd won the legal skirmish, but the war inside me raged on. My ranch hands, a tight crew of 5 who'd seen me through worse, kept the place running while I wrestled with what came next. The cows, those unwitting accomplices in Karen's downfall, grazed peacefully, oblivious to the chaos they'd caused. But peace was a lie. Trouble was brewing, and I could feel it in my bones. Karen didn't vanish quietly. A week after the settlement, I got a call from a local reporter, a young guy named Ethan who ran a blog about Bitterroot scandals. "Jack, you hear about Karen's latest move?" he asked, voice crackling with excitement. I hadn't. Apparently, she'd taken to social media, spinning a sob story about how I, the bitter rancher, had sabotaged her fairy tale wedding out of jealousy. She posted photos, carefully curated shots of her mud-splattered dress, a toppled cake, and tearful guests captioned with hashtags like Rancher Revenge and Justice for Karen. The posts were gaining traction, painting me as the villain in her melodrama. Comments piled up, strangers calling me a petty tyrant, a cow-wielding maniac. I laughed it off at first. City folks wouldn't understand a rancher's pride, but the lies started to fester. Then the letters started. Anonymous, typed, slipped under my door or mailed with no return address. "You'll pay for what you did," one read. "Your cows won't save you next time," said another. I brushed them off as Karen's petty revenge, but my lead hand, Maria, wasn't so sure. "Jack, this feels personal," she said one evening, her brow furrowed as she handed me another envelope. Maria had been with me for a decade, tough as the land itself, and her worry made me pause. I didn't tell her about the late-night noises, gates rattling, footsteps in the gravel, because I didn't want to admit I was rattled too. The tension broke one frigid morning when I found my fence line cut. A quarter-mile of wire, sliced clean, with hoofprints leading into the hills. 20 of my cattle were gone, scattered or stolen. I called Tom, the sheriff, who surveyed the damage with a grim nod. "This ain't kids pulling pranks, Jack," he said. Someone's got a grudge. I didn't need to guess who. Karen's social media campaign had turned her into a martyr, and now someone, maybe a loyal friend, maybe a hired thug, was hitting me where it hurt. My ranch wasn't just my home, it was my livelihood. Losing cattle wasn't just a financial hit, it was a gut punch to everything my dad had built. I gathered my crew and we rode out to track the missing herd. The search took us into the high country, where the air was thin and the snow dusted the ridges. We found 10 cows, spooked but unharmed, in a gully. The rest were gone, tracks vanishing into the rocky terrain. As we drove the survivors back, I caught Maria's eye. "Karen's behind this," I said. She didn't argue, just tightened her grip on the reins. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, a whiskey in hand, staring at the legal papers from our settlement. I thought it was over, but Karen was playing a longer game, one I hadn't seen coming. I decided to fight fire with fire. Ethan, the reporter, was eager to help. "Give me something juicy, Jack," he said, leaning across a diner booth, his recorder blinking. I told him everything: Karen's fake tears, her secret land deals, the way she twisted our friendship into a weapon. Ethan's story hit his blog the next day, titled, "The Wedding Crasher's Real Scam: How Karen Played a Rancher for Profit." He included screenshots of her shady contracts, dug up by a friend in the county records office. The post spread faster than her sob story, and the tide began to turn. Locals who'd known my family for decades rallied, leaving comments about my dad's honesty, my ranch's legacy. Karen's hashtags lost their shine. But victory was short-lived. 2 nights later, I woke to the smell of smoke. My barn, the heart of the ranch, where we stored hay and equipment, was ablaze. I ran barefoot into the snow, shouting for Maria and the crew. We fought the fire with hoses and buckets until the volunteer fire department arrived, but the damage was done. Half the barn was ash, and with it, thousands in supplies. The fire chief, a gruff woman named Lena, pulled me aside. "Arson," she said flatly. "Gasoline traces." This was deliberate. My stomach dropped. Karen's face flashed in my mind, her cold eyes in that hotel lobby. "Just business," she'd said. This wasn't business, this was war. Tom launched an investigation, but evidence was thin. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just a can of gas dumped in the brush. Karen had an alibi: she was in Seattle, posting about her healing journey online. But I knew better. She had the money, the motive, and the kind of friends who'd light a match for her. I couldn't prove it, but I could feel it. My crew was shaken. Maria wanted to quit, scared for her family. I convinced her to stay, promising better security cameras, lights, a night watch. But the ranch felt violated, its quiet stolen. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for my sanity. I tracked Karen down through a mutual friend. She was back in Montana, staying at a fancy cabin an hour away. I drove there at dawn, my truck rattling over icy roads. When she opened the door, wrapped in a designer scarf, she didn't look surprised. "Jack," she said, voice flat. "What now?" I stepped closer, keeping my temper in check. "The barn. The cattle. Stop it, Karen, or I'll bury you in court." She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You think I'd risk my nails for your little farm? Get over yourself." But her eyes flickered, just for a second, and I knew. She wasn't done with me. I left without another word, but I wasn't giving up. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Dan who'd seen worse than Karen's schemes. He dug into her finances, her contacts, her alibis. Slowly, the pieces came together: a burner phone linked to her, a payment to a lowlife in Missoula, a trail of texts planning revenge. It wasn't airtight, but it was enough to scare her. I sent her a message through Ethan: "Drop it, or we go public." Her social media went silent the next day. The ranch limped on. We rebuilt the barn, rounded up stray cattle, and installed cameras that caught nothing but coyotes. But the damage wasn't just physical. I'd lost something deeper: trust, maybe, or the naive belief that friendship could outlast greed. Karen had taken more than my land's piece, she'd taken a piece of my past. I thought of my dad, who taught me to stand tall but fair. Had I gone too far with the cows? Maybe. But she'd pushed me there, and I'd pushed back. By spring, the valley thawed, and so did I. The wildflowers returned, stubborn as ever, and the ranch felt alive again. Karen faded into the background, her schemes unraveling as her allies distanced themselves. I heard she moved to California, chasing another hustle. I didn't care. My home was mine again, scarred but standing. The cows, oblivious heroes, grazed under a wide sky, and I let myself smile. Sometimes, justice smells like dust and hooves. Spring brought new life to the ranch, but the scars of Karen's war lingered like shadows on the hills. The rebuilt barn stood sturdy, its fresh timbers a testament to my crew's grit, but every creak of its beams reminded me of the fire, the betrayal, the cost. I'd pushed Karen out of my life, or so I thought, but her shadow had a way of creeping back. My investigator, Dan, kept digging, and what he found next wasn't just a knife in the back, it was a whole damn armory. Dan called me one morning as I was mending a fence, the sun barely cresting the Bitterroot peaks. "Jack, you sitting down?" he asked, his voice gruff. I wasn't, but I leaned against a post, bracing myself. He'd traced Karen's burner phone to a series of calls with a local contractor, a shady type named Vince who'd been sniffing around my land for years. Vince had a reputation for acquiring property cheap, usually after the owner hit hard times. Dan's intel was damning. Karen hadn't just been leasing my land for events. She'd been working with Vince to drive me into bankruptcy, force a sale, and split the profits. The wedding, the cattle theft, the fire, they weren't just revenge. They were steps in a plan to steal my ranch out from under me. I felt sick, the kind of nausea that comes from realizing someone you trusted saw you as prey. Karen had played me from the start, using our college friendship like a chess piece. Every late-night talk, every shared memory, was a lie she'd banked on to keep me blind. I thanked Dan and hung up, staring at the horizon. The wildflowers my dad loved swayed in the breeze, and I swore I'd fight for this place until my last breath. Karen wanted a war. She'd get one. I took Dan's evidence to Tom, the sheriff. He listened, his jaw tightening as I laid out the phone records, the payments, the texts. "This is serious, Jack," he said, flipping through the file. "But it's circumstantial. We need more to nail her." I nodded, knowing he was right but hating it. Karen was slippery, always one step ahead. Still, Tom agreed to question Vince, who'd been spotted near my ranch the night of the fire. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Ethan's blog kept the pressure on. His latest post, "The Ranch Heist, Karen's Plot to Steal a Legacy," went viral in our small town. Locals stopped me at the diner, offering support, sharing stories of Karen's scams, fake charity drives, shady real estate deals. She'd burned bridges before, but mine was the one she'd torched with gasoline. The community's backing gave me strength, but it didn't erase the dread. Every night, I checked the cameras, half expecting another fire, another cut fence. Sleep came in fits, haunted by the what-ifs. What if I'd never let her use the ranch? What if I'd closed that damn gate? Vince cracked under Tom's questioning, spilling just enough to point fingers at Karen. He claimed she'd paid him to disrupt my operations, nothing explicit about the fire, but enough to tie her to the cattle theft. Tom hauled her in for questioning, and I drove to the station, needing to see her face. She sat in the interrogation room, visible through a one-way window, her composure fraying. Gone was the polished bride. She looked tired, her designer scarf replaced by a cheap sweater. When Tom pressed her about Vince, she deflected, claiming it was all business misunderstandings. But her voice shook, and I saw it crack in her armor. For the first time, Karen looked scared. The legal system moved slow, but Dan's digging kept turning up dirt. He found a paper trail linking Karen to offshore accounts, a web of shell companies she'd used to funnel money. It wasn't just my ranch, targeted other properties, preying on trusting locals with big dreams and small budgets. I shared everything with Ethan, who turned it into a series of exposés. Karen's name became toxic, her social media accounts went dark, her healing journey abandoned. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was empty. The ranch was safe, for now, but at what cost? My trust in people, in friendship, was shattered. Then came the final blow. Dan called me late one night, his voice heavy. "Jack, you need to hear this." He'd intercepted a voicemail Karen left for Vince, recorded before her questioning. In it, she ranted about me, her words dripping with venom. "Jack thinks he's untouchable, but I'll burn his whole world down if I have to." It wasn't proof of the fire, but it was close enough. Tom used it to leverage a plea deal. Karen copped to lesser charges: conspiracy, fraud, avoiding jail but paying a hefty fine and restitution. Vince took a harder fall, charged with theft and vandalism. The ranch got a payout, enough to rebuild and then some, but money couldn't fix what she'd broken. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. A month later, Maria found a letter nailed to the barn door, handwritten in Karen's unmistakable scrawl. "You won this round, Jack," it read. "But I'm not done." No signature, just her initials K.H. like a taunt. I burned the letter, but her words haunted me. I upgraded the ranch's security, hired extra hands, and told Maria to keep her shotgun loaded. The ranch was my fortress now, and I'd defend it with everything I had. Summer rolled in, and the valley bloomed, but the joy I'd once found in its beauty was tainted. I walked the fields alone, thinking of my dad, who taught me to trust people, to see the good in them. I'd failed him, letting Karen in, letting her poison spread. The cows, those damn cows, were the only ones who'd come through unscathed. They grazed, oblivious, as I rebuilt my life piece by piece. Maria and the crew stayed loyal, their laughter a small light in the dark. Ethan's blog moved on to new scandals, and Tom kept an eye on Karen's movements. She'd left Montana, but I knew she'd be back. People like her always were. As I stood by the creek one evening, watching the water catch the sunset's glow, I realized the real cost of Karen's betrayal. It wasn't the barn, the cattle, or the money. It was the part of me that believed in second chances, in old friends, in the idea that people could change. Karen had taken that, and no lawsuit could bring it back. I'd let my cows crash her wedding out of anger, but in the end, she'd crashed something deeper: me faith in humanity. I turned back to the ranch house, its lights warm against the dusk. The wildflowers nodded in the breeze, resilient, like me. I'd survived Karen's schemes, her fire, her lies. But the victory was bitter, a hollow echo of the life I'd known. The cows lowed in the distance, and I let myself laugh, just once. They'd started this mess, and maybe they'd ended it too. But as I walked inside, I knew one thing for sure: if Karen ever came back, I'd be ready. And this time, I wouldn't just let the cows loose. I'd open every damn gate.